Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Michael Corinthos had spent months caught in a relentless cycle of vengeance, resentment, and calculated maneuvers. Driven by his unresolved anger toward Drew Kane and the fractured relationships that shadowed his personal life. For so long, his decisions had been fueled by the need to outmaneuver Drew and prove himself unshakable in a world where betrayal lingered at every corner. Yet the unexpected arrival of Jacinda Bracken marked the beginning of a dangerous, transformative chapter in his life. What began as a pragmatic alliance between two unlikely partners soon evolved into something much darker, more complex, and undeniably personal. At first glance, Jacinda seemed like nothing more than a mercenary figure, a woman defined by her reputation as someone who lived for money, using her body and cunning to secure the comfort and power she desired. Her motivations were transparent. She would help Michael for financial gain, supplying him with the alibi he so desperately needed on the night Drew was shot. It was meant to be a simple exchange of silence and loyalty in return for his protection and resources. Yet, what neither of them anticipated was how quickly a web of survival and manipulation could morph into a connection that neither could easily break away from. For Jacinda, everything about Michael should have been transactional. She had lived much of her life detached from real intimacy, insulating herself from vulnerability by treating sex, loyalty, and companionship as commodities to be bought and sold. To her, men were either clients or pawns, and she prided herself on never confusing money with emotion. But Michael disrupted that system in ways she could not have predicted. The intensity in his gaze, the ruthless conviction in his choices, and even the moments of weakness he tried so hard to hide, these were things that began to unravel the walls she had so carefully built. In the stolen seconds between whispered strategies and tense silences where danger hung in the air, Jacinda began to feel something she had long buried, a stirring of genuine emotion. It was not love at first sight, nor was it some grand romantic epiphany, but rather a slow erosion of her defenses until she could no longer deny that Michael mattered to her in ways money never could. Michael himself was not blind to the transformation. Though his original intent was purely strategic, using Jacinda as leverage, protection, and distraction against Drew, began to recognize qualities in her that went beyond utility. There was a resilience in her spirit, a sharp intelligence in the way she anticipated moves, and a vulnerability that emerged in the rare moments when she let her mask slip. He had expected her to be cold, calculating, self-serving, and she was all those things, but she was also capable of loyalty that shocked him. Their alliance forced them into proximity, and proximity bred understanding. Michael began to see her not as a liability or a tool, but as someone who could understand the shadows he walked through. In Jacinda, he found not only a co-conspirator but an unexpected equal, someone who knew the weight of compromise, the scars of betrayal, and the intoxication of power. As their partnership deepened, the lines between strategy and sentiment blurred. The chemistry between them was undeniable, but what unsettled them both was how much of it was real. Were they still playing roles, or had the act become the truth? For Jacinda, every stolen glance and lingering touch began to carry weight. She found herself questioning decisions, hesitating when she should have remained ruthless, and silently hoping that Michael saw her as more than just another pawn in his war with Drew. For Michael, the danger was even greater. He was a man still haunted by the wreckage of his relationship with Willow Tate, still fueled by the bitterness of betrayal, yet here he was entertaining the possibility of something new, something far riskier than any scheme he had ever devised. The pivotal moment came when Michael and Jacinda decided that the only way to completely dismantle Drew's power and secure their own dominance was through marriage. At first, it seemed like a brilliant tactic, a union of two people whose alliance could no longer be dismissed as temporary. Together, they could consolidate influence, legitimize their partnership in the eyes of the world, and create a united front so unshakable that Drew's credibility would crumble. Yet beneath the surface of that strategy was a deeper and spoken truth. Neither of them was entirely opposed to the idea of binding themselves to the other, not just in name but in something dangerously close to emotion. Jacinda knew that marrying Michael would give her a security she had never known, while Michael sensed that she offered a kind of loyalty that was rare and intoxicating. The plan to wed began as a calculated strike but evolved into something far messier, filled with longing, fear, and desire. For Willow, this development was intolerable. Watching from the outside, she could not comprehend how Michael had fallen so far, aligning himself with a woman whose past was defined by transactional intimacy and deception. The very idea of Jacinda stepping into the role of Michael's wife, a role Willow once believed was hers alone, ignited a fury that was as personal as it was moral. Willow saw the marriage not only as a betrayal but as an outright declaration of war against her values and her history with Michael. In her eyes, Jacinda was not just a threat, she was the living embodiment of everything Michael had become, a man so consumed by his vendetta that he would sell his soul to the highest bidder. And yet, Willow's rage was not without complexity. Beneath her fury lay a trace of fear, a fear that perhaps Michael's feelings for Jacinda were no longer rooted in strategy but in something heartbreakingly real. Every time Michael looked at Jacinda with that rare flicker of softness, every time Jacinda responded with something resembling genuine affection, Willow's worst suspicions seemed confirmed. The woman who began this journey with Michael for money now held a piece of his heart, and that made her dangerous in ways Willow could never have prepared for. What began as a cold, calculated partnership had transformed into a volatile fusion of love, lust, and ambition. Michael and Jacinda, once allies by necessity, were now bound by something deeper, though no less perilous. Their decision to marry was both their greatest weapon and their greatest vulnerability, for in the treacherous world they inhabited, love was not a sanctuary but another battlefield. And as the storm gathered around them with Drew still looming, Willow's fury burning bright, and the weight of their secrets threatening to surface, each question remained: had they found in each other the kind of love that could withstand the darkness? Or had they simply set themselves on a path that would destroy them both? Michael, though still chained to the bitterness and unresolved fury he carried for Willow Tate, found himself unable to deny the strange and undeniable pull Jacinda Bracken had over him. What began as a calculated alliance meant to serve his vendetta against Drew Kane slowly twisted into something much more complicated. Something that gnawed at him in moments of silence when strategy no longer occupied his mind. At first, he believed their connection was nothing more than a necessary arrangement, a temporary bond forged by desperation and ambition. Jacinda offered him a shield when he needed protection, and in turn, he gave her the resources and opportunities she craved. But over time, Michael discovered that there was more to Jacinda than her past, more than her reputation for selling loyalty to the highest bidder. He began to see a strength, a sharpness of will, and even a glimmer of vulnerability that spoke to him in ways he did not anticipate. She was no longer just a pawn in his war against Drew, she was becoming an anchor in the chaos that defined his life. Their dangerous partnership began to stretch far beyond legal cover-ups and whispered strategies in the shadows. In one another, they found not only accomplices in schemes designed to dismantle Drew's influence, but also partners in a dance of desire and intrigue that neither of them could fully control. The energy between them was volatile, thrilling, and deeply uncertain, a mix of passion and peril that blurred the lines between genuine connection and dangerous obsession. For Michael, the allure was undeniable. For Jacinda, who once believed she could keep emotion separate from survival, the realization was even more unsettling. They were no longer merely surviving together, they were thriving in ways that made them increasingly dangerous, both to their enemies and perhaps even to themselves. This growing entanglement eventually gave birth to an audacious idea, one that neither might have considered at the beginning but that now seemed like the only logical next step: marriage. On the surface, it was a brilliant maneuver, a way to legitimize their partnership and transform it into a weapon no rival could easily discredit. By uniting their lives publicly, they could not only present a seamless front but also draw a line in the sand that would force Drew into a corner. For Michael, the marriage was a declaration of permanency, a symbolic act that said he no longer needed Willow, no longer sought her approval or forgiveness. For Jacinda, it was both a triumph and a transformation. No longer just a woman lingering in the periphery of power, she would become central to Michael's world, an undeniable force in his war and a permanent fixture in his life. The wedding itself was never intended to be a celebration of love in the traditional sense. It was carefully crafted as a spectacle of dominance, a move designed to destabilize Drew by making him appear isolated, stripped of credibility, and powerless to resist the new alliance standing against him. Every detail of the ceremony, from the guest list to the public narrative that would follow, was meant to send a message: Michael and Jacinda were untouchable, united, and unstoppable. Yet beneath the layers of strategy and manipulation lay something more fragile but equally real. Jacinda could not deny the excitement that coursed through her at the thought of being at Michael's side, not merely as his accomplice, but as his chosen partner. And Michael, despite telling himself this was all part of the game, recognized and spoke in truth that some part of him truly wanted her there, not as a shield or a weapon, but as a companion. This marriage, then, was both a masterstroke of power and a dangerous gamble of the heart. To the outside world, it was a ruthless maneuver, an act of calculated defiance aimed squarely at Drew. But for Michael and Jacinda, it was also the culmination of a connection they had once denied but could no longer ignore. By marrying Jacinda, Michael was making more than just a tactical decision. He was affirming that he was done with his past, done with Willow, and ready to embrace a future built on both love and lies. Jacinda, for her part, understood that stepping into this role meant embracing not only Michael's ambitions but also his demons. She was no longer an outsider chasing money. She was at the very center of his storm, a partner in both his vengeance and his unexpected vulnerability. The union of Michael and Jacinda thus became more than a strategy. It was a declaration of war, a reshaping of identities, and perhaps the most dangerous risk either of them had ever taken. What began as a temporary alliance of convenience had grown into a volatile, consuming relationship, one that blurred the line between manipulation and true devotion. Together, they had chosen to weaponize their bond, turning their intimacy into an instrument of destruction aimed at Drew. Yet with every calculated step they took, they also wove themselves deeper into a connection that neither could fully control. Whether this marriage would secure their victory or expose them to ruin remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. Michael had left Willow behind, and with Jacinda at his side, he was prepared to burn down everything in his path. But it was this very choice that shattered Willow to her core. She could hardly fathom that Michael, the man she had once trusted with her whole heart, the man she believed to be her anchor through life's storms, would so openly align himself with Jacinda Bracken, a woman whose past was steeped in compromise, scandal, and a reputation that had always kept her on the fringes of respectability. For Willow, the betrayal was not simply about Michael finding comfort in another's arms. It was about the brazen defiance with which he paraded this new bond, transforming it into a marriage that was as much a weapon as it was a union. To Willow, this was no longer the Michael she had once loved, no longer the man who fought for family or clung to values she thought were intrinsic to his character. What stood before her now was a colder, harder version of him, a man capable of discarding morality if it meant achieving his goals, a man willing to embrace deception as easily as truth. Her rage only deepened as the facade of strategy began to crumble, revealing something Willow could neither dismiss nor endure. There was real feeling between Michael and Jacinda. What began as a transactional alliance, a calculated ploy to shield themselves and dismantle Drew's credibility, was now morphing into something undeniably authentic. Willow could see it in their eyes when they looked at one another, in the way Jacinda's sharp edges seemed to soften around him, and in the subtle gestures Michael made, the kind that carried echoes of intimacy she had once known so well. It was unbearable to watch, not only because it confirmed her deepest fears but because it made the betrayal sting all the more. If Jacinda had remained the mercenary figure she had always been, motivated by money and touched by sentiment, Willow might have found a way to endure. She could have convinced herself it was a temporary arrangement, a shallow alliance destined to collapse under the weight of its own falsehoods. But the shift was undeniable. Jacinda had begun to feel something real for Michael, and Michael, in turn, had allowed himself to respond. That reality turned what could have been dismissed as a stunt into something far more dangerous, something that threatened Willow not only emotionally, but existentially. She was no longer competing with an illusion or a pretense. She was being erased by a bond forged in the collision of love and conspiracy. For Willow, the stakes could not have been higher. She realized that what Jacinda and Michael were building together was not merely a public narrative designed to weaken Drew, but a genuine fusion of ambition and affection. It was the kind of dangerous chemistry that could outlast any scheme, the kind that could fortify their positions against all odds. What unsettled Willow most was that their marriage, once dismissed in her mind as an elaborate act of theater, was quickly proving itself to be something more enduring. She had once believed she knew every corner of Michael's heart, but now she was forced to confront the chilling truth. He had opened it to another, and not just anyone. but to a woman she considered unworthy and treacherous. The fury that consumed Willow was more than personal heartbreak, it was the rage of someone being deliberately erased from the narrative of a man's life she once shared. Every smile, every whispered touch between Michael and Jacinda mocked her pain and underscored the reality that she was no longer a part of his story. Instead, she had been displaced, made obsolete by a woman who had entered through the back door of deceit and somehow secured the very place Willow once held sacred. In Willow's eyes, this union of love and deceit was the most dangerous weapon imaginable, for it combined the ruthlessness of ambition with the vulnerability of genuine affection. Together, Michael and Jacinda were no longer just conspirators but partners bound by something even more potent. That combination left Willow isolated, silenced, and unable to dismantle them the way she might have dismantled a purely political arrangement. In that moment, she came to understand the cruelest truth of all. She was no longer fighting to reclaim her love, but rather battling the specter of a love that had already replaced her. And in a world where lies and schemes ruled the day, the most unforgivable betrayal was discovering that Michael's heart had truly moved on. Willow's grief and fury only grew heavier with each passing day, the weight of betrayal pressing down on her chest until it felt as though she could hardly breathe. She had believed, perhaps naively, that no matter the fractures in their relationship, no matter the resentments that lingered between them, Michael Corinthos would never take the step of aligning himself so deeply with someone like Jacinda Bracken. For years, Willow had known Michael as the man who carried burdens with a sense of duty, the man who would fight for family even when it meant sacrificing his own peace of mind. But now, as she watched him entwine his life with Jacinda's, she no longer saw the man she had loved. Instead, she saw a figure hardened by vendetta, sharpened by ambition, and willing to cloak himself in deceit if it meant achieving his ends. To Willow, Michael's marriage was not just a betrayal of her love, it was the ultimate renunciation of the values she once thought he cherished. What made the wound deeper, however, was the unmistakable authenticity that began to bleed through the cracks of what should have been only a performance. The early days of Michael and Jacinda's alliance had been steeped in strategy and survival, their interactions shaped by necessity rather than affection. Jacinda was meant to be an accessory to Michael's plan, a convenient partner who offered him an alibi, a weapon, and an edge against Drew Kane. Yet, as time pressed forward, Willow could no longer deny what her eyes revealed. The glances between them lingered too long to be feigned, their touches carried an intimacy no script could replicate, and their words too often masked in calculation echoed with a sincerity that betrayed something far deeper. Michael and Jacinda had crossed an invisible threshold, one where pretense had dissolved into truth, and that was what made it unbearable. Willow knew that if Jacinda's loyalty remained rooted solely in money, the alliance could have been undone with time, exposed as hollow and fragile. But this was not the case anymore. Jacinda had begun to feel, to care, and to invest not just her cunning but her heart into Michael. And Michael, in turn, had not resisted. He had opened himself to her, given her space within his guarded walls, and allowed her to take root in places that once belonged to Willow. This realization was not simply painful, it was devastating. It meant that Willow was not only displaced strategically but replaced emotionally, and that truth struck harder than any scheme or conspiracy ever could. She was no longer facing a temporary rival but a woman who had woven herself into the very fabric of Michael's life, solidifying her place with both love and deception. Around them, the world began to take notice. What many dismissed at first as a clever ploy, a marriage designed to intimidate and discredit Drew, now appeared to be something dangerously real. Michael and Jacinda had become a force, their bond lending them a kind of credibility that no performance could fully sustain without authenticity. Their unity unsettled allies and adversaries alike, for it was built not only on a foundation of shared ambition but also on the fuel of passion. In the ruthless world they inhabited, this combination was more potent than any single plan they had found in each other, both the weapon and the shield. To those watching, the question became not whether their union was sincere, but whether such intensity could possibly endure without tearing them apart. For Willow, every public appearance, every whispered story of Michael and Jacinda's closeness was another knife to the heart. She watched as they transformed what was once a dangerous ruse into a partnership that held the power to reshape the battlefield entirely. The marriage was not simply a declaration against Drew, it was a declaration against her. In every vow they exchanged, she heard Michael severing his ties to her, casting her aside with a finality she had never imagined possible. It was as if she had been erased from the story altogether, replaced by a woman she considered unworthy, yet one who had succeeded in ways Willow herself had not. Her anger became a firestorm, no longer just personal grief but a rage that demanded reckoning. And yet, the irony that haunted her was this: in their attempt to secure their dominance, Michael and Jacinda may have created the very cracks that could undo them. Their love, as undeniable as it was, had become both their strongest bond and their greatest vulnerability. Real emotion, while powerful, also meant exposure. It meant that their enemies could exploit their attachment, that betrayal could wound deeper than strategy ever could, and that the truth told its surface could devastate them both beyond repair. The marriage that promised invincibility might one day prove to be the spark that ignited their destruction. Still, for the moment, Michael and Jacinda stood hand in hand at the center of the storm, their grip on each other fierce, their resolve unshaken. They walked into their marriage with the conviction that they had forged something unbreakable, a union that transcended the games they played and the lies they told. To Willow and the rest of the world, however, it was impossible to ignore the fragility that lingered beneath their defiance. Love and power made for a volatile mixture, one that could elevate them to unimagined heights or plunge them into ruin without warning. And so the world held its breath, caught between awe and dread, watching as Michael and Jacinda built their empire upon the thinnest of linest line between devotion and destruction. Willow, standing outside that circle, burned with fury and sorrow, her heart demanding retribution even as her mind warned her of the futility of fighting what had already been set in motion. She knew, as did everyone watching, that this was no longer just a battle of strategies or schemes. This was a war fought with hearts as much as with weapons, and the price of losing would not simply be measured in power, but in the total annihilation of whoever fell behind.